It was raining the night she showed up, the kind of rain that doesn't just fall, it wraps around you like sorrow. I remember opening the door to see her standing there, soaked through mascara sliding down her cheekbones like ink bleeding from a diary page. She held a suitcase in one hand and clutched a cheap plastic bag in the other one that carried more apologies than belongings. She looked up at me like I was the last lit porch light in a world that had gone dark. I didn't know where else to go, she said, her voice barely a whisper beneath the weight of the storm. I didn't ask questions. I just moved aside, let her in, and shut the door on the wind. I gave her towels, hot tea, and a quiet place to land. That's what you do when someone comes to you looking for shelter. You don't ask how long they're staying. You just make sure they're warm enough to sleep through the night. I tucked a quilt around her shoulders and told her she could rest in the spare room, the one I had kept neat even after my husband passed. It had stayed untouched for years like a time capsule, but something in me stirred when I watched her curl up in that bed. A memory, maybe. A reflex. Or maybe just the ache of having too much silence and too many pillows. I told myself it was temporary. A few nights, maybe a week. I was still sharp back then, still made my own meals, still remembered birthdays without checking the calendar, still walked to the corner store for apples and crossword books. But loneliness makes strange things feel normal. I convinced myself I was doing something good, something kind. And maybe in those first few days I was. She cried a lot in the beginning. I'd hear her sobbing through the wall at night, her voice stifled under the weight of the old floral duvet. I never pried, but I left her fresh laundry folded on the end of the bed each morning, like I used to do for my daughter when she visited in college. She started coming out of her shell bit by bit, first asking for coffee, then sitting with me during reruns of my shows. She laughed at the canned laughter. It wasn't the same laugh she used later. This one was gentler, unsure, like a baby bird finding its voice. She started calling me Mama by the third week. It was casual, almost flippant, like she was trying on the word to see how it felt. And it did something to me, lit something old and flickering. I never corrected her. I let her say it again and again as if it were a charm. And when my neighbor stopped by with a plate of gingerbread cookies, I introduced the girl as family. Just like a daughter to me, I'd said. I remember the smile she gave then. It was the kind of smile that hides its teeth. I didn't notice when her suitcase became a dresser, or when her grocery preferences replaced mine, or when my bathroom shelves, once tidy and sparse, became littered with creams and bottles I couldn't pronounce. The change was gradual, like ivy growing along a wall. You don't see it moving, but one day it covers the view entirely. I chalked it all up to youth. She's just young, I'd whisper to myself, as I moved her dishes back to the right cabinet, as I refolded the towels she tossed carelessly on the floor. She'll learn. But it wasn't that she didn't know it was, that she didn't care. Still, that first night, I think about it sometimes. The way she looked so small in that doorway, like someone who had been told one too many times that she didn't matter. I wonder if that was true, or if she just knew how to play the part. Either way, I took her in. I gave her warmth, and more importantly, I gave her trust. The kind of trust that older women hand out carefully, with years of caution stitched into every thread. But I handed it to her like it was nothing, like it was just a cup of tea on a cold night. Maybe I needed to feel needed. Maybe I missed the sound of footsteps in the hall. Maybe I just wanted to believe that kindness could still bloom in an old house like mine. Whatever the reason I opened the door, I let her in. And I would spend the rest of the year learning what that choice would cost me. The first time I noticed she wasn't leaving was when I went to strip the bed and found her clothes in the drawers. Not just folded laundry, but neatly placed like someone who believed they belonged. scarves tucked into the corners like they'd always been there, a perfume bottle on the nightstand that wasn't mine. I paused, my hand hovering over the drawer handle, feeling the strange weight of permanence. I hadn't offered her the room forever. I hadn't offered her forever at all. But when I asked her gently, cautiously how long she planned to stay, she only laughed. That breathy kind of laugh, as though the question itself was silly. "Mama," she said, brushing past me, "we're so good together. Why would I go back to chaos? That was how she referred to her old life. I never knew the details, only fragments, an argument with a man, a job that didn't appreciate her, a city that swallowed her up. I didn't need to know more. Her eyes did the storytelling in those first few weeks, and I let them. Still something in that answer pricked at me. Not the words themselves, but the certainty in them. Like she had already rewritten her place in my world without waiting for permission. She started leaving shoes by the door. Not just one pair, but several heels sneakers, little fuzzy boots she never wore, but liked to display. My tidy front entry became a collage of her steps. Her purse, always open and spilling with receipts and gloss, found its place on my kitchen counter. When I tried to move it, she gave me that look. You know, the one chin, slightly raised eyebrows arched just enough to say, "Don't touch what's mine." Except none of it was, not really. She changed the curtains in the spare room, too. She said the floral print gave her headaches, that it felt too grandmotherly. I stood beside her as she clipped up pale gray panels with silver rings, erasing my late husband's favorite blue and violet ones. "Doesn't that feel better?" she asked, stepping back with hands on hips like an interior designer. I didn't know what to say, so I nodded. I'd gotten good at nodding. Then came the television, the one in the living room. My living room was never on past 9 p.m. That had always been my rule. A quiet house helped me sleep, helped me feel like I was still in control of something. But she'd binge shows into the early hours, the flicker of moving images leaking under my door like restless ghosts. I asked her once, just once, if she could turn it down. She stared at me blankly and said I needed to fall asleep, so I started using earplugs. Some days she was sweetness. She'd brew chamomile tea and bring it to me unasked. Other days she'd sulk, say nothing, slam cabinets for reasons I could never name. I'd find my own linens mixed in with hers, the fragrance of her detergent soaking into the towels I once loved. And every time I entered a room, I had to pause to see what had changed. It was always something small. A lamp shifted a photo, removed a drawer, rearranged. Slowly she was making my home her own, one tiny theft at a time. When my sister called from the coast and asked if I was still alone, I hesitated before answering. "I have company," I said. "She's staying a while." I didn't know how to explain it. I didn't know how to say that someone could live with you and still make you feel lonely in brand new ways. The kind of loneliness that creeps in during the day when you're wide awake and still feel unseen. She didn't cook much, but when she did, the kitchen was chaos. Spices spilled, pans left soaking music so loud it drowned out my thoughts. She laughed then, a deep, full-body kind of laugh I hadn't heard in those early weeks. I watched her dance between countertops, her voice rising with the beat, and I wondered if I'd invited in joy or just noise. Once she turned to me and said, "You should get out more," as if my home had become a cage of my own making. But it was her voice that made the walls feel smaller, her presence that made the air feel thinner. I was disappearing in my own space, and I couldn't quite name it yet, but I felt it, like a draft that keeps brushing your neck, but you can't find the window it's coming from. And still I did nothing. I smiled. I nodded. I said thank you when she dropped a pair of discount socks in my lap and called it a gift. I let her keep the room. I let her name the furniture. I let her turn the spare room into something sacred, though it had always belonged to memory, not her. I told myself I was being generous. I told myself kindness would pay off. But the truth, the quiet truth, I didn't want to face yet, was this. She never asked to belong. She just decided she did. I think the moment it truly changed was so quiet, so subtle that I almost missed it. I was setting the table for dinner, 2 plates, 2 sets of silverware, 2 cloth napkins I'd ironed just that morning. I'd roasted chicken with rosemary, the way my husband liked it, the way I'd taught my daughter before she moved out. It wasn't a special occasion, just a Sunday. But for me, Sundays had always meant something. They were ritual, a way of saying we're still here and we still care. She didn't come downstairs. I waited a while, humming to myself, letting the candles burn low. I even ladled the gravy into my grandmother's china boat, the one I never brought out, unless there was company. But the minutes passed and her seat stayed empty. Eventually, I went up, knocked softly, and asked if she was coming. She opened the door with her phone in hand, earbuds in, and barely looked up. "Oh, I already ate," she said. Just like that, no apology, no explanation. Just those 4 words, like the meal I'd prepared slowly, lovingly, meant nothing at all. I stood there for a moment, waiting for something. A thank you, a smile, even guilt. But she had already turned back to her screen. The door didn't slam, but it might as well have. That night I sat alone and tried to eat around the lump in my throat. I'd spent my whole life taking care of people, children, neighbors, my husband in his final months. I knew how to be there. I knew how to hold space. But no one tells you how to handle being invisible. It sneaks up on you, the sense that your effort has become a background noise, like a song no one listens to anymore. She stopped calling me Mama around that time, not all at once, just a gradual fade like paint peeling off an old fence. One day it was Mama, the next it was just hey, and soon she'd start her sentences without even addressing me at all. That little word that once lit something in my chest became extinct, and in its place came something colder, distance, wrapped in casual tone. When I try to talk to her, just simple things like asking about her day or what time she'd be home, she'd give me that sideways glance, the kind people give the elderly when they're trying to be polite, but wish you'd stop talking. "I'm busy," she'd say. "Can we not do this right now?" Like I was interrupting something more important. And maybe I was. Maybe her phone, her friends, her curated life online offered more than I ever could. I cleaned up after her more than I should have. Dirty mugs left on windowsills, makeup stains on my guest towels, shoes strewn across the living room like she was trying to trip me on purpose. And every time I picked something up, I told myself I was being kind, that this was what family did. But my hands started trembling more often. My back ached from bending over, and my mind, once so clear and sharp, began to fog from the quiet strain of being erased in my own home. She'd call me dramatic if I said something was bothering me. "It's not that deep," she'd say, waving a hand like my feelings were a fly in her soup. She even laughed once when I mispronounced a singer's name. Not a soft teasing laugh, but a full, sharp one, like I was something to mock. And when I asked her what was funny, she said, "You're just so out of touch, Mama. It's kinda cute." But it didn't feel cute. It felt like being shoved into a corner you can't get out of. Once I offered to bake a pie for a gathering she was invited to. She rolled her eyes and said, "People don't eat pie anymore," as if I were some relic from a dusty museum. I remember standing there, pie dish in hand, heartbreaking quietly, and she didn't even see it. Or if she did, she didn't care. She started talking about me like I wasn't there. On calls with friends, I'd overhear her saying, "It's fine. I'm just crashing with some sweet old lady. She's harmless, harmless." The word stung more than I expected. Not kind, not wise, not warm, just harmless, like a decorative pillow, like something you keep around because it doesn't get in the way. And yet I kept making her tea, kept folding her laundry, kept asking if she needed anything. That's the thing about women like me. We were raised to serve, to smile, to take pride in care. We grew up on sacrifice like it was bread and water. But the hunger it left in me was growing louder. I could feel something inside me stretching thin, like a thread pulled too tight. I began to notice things missing. A few dollars from the kitchen drawer, a necklace I hadn't worn in years gone from its box. Little things I couldn't prove. And when I asked her carefully if she'd seen them, she looked offended. "Why would I take your stuff?" she snapped. "God, Mama, you're getting paranoid." That word stuck. Paranoid. It clanged in my ears like a pot dropped on tile. She made me feel crazy for noticing the shift. And that, I think, was the worst part. Not the missing things, not the rolled eyes, but the slow, intentional unraveling of my sense of truth. Gaslight in silk gloves. Still, I said nothing. Because family stays, because love forgives, because I didn't want to believe she'd stopped seeing me as a person. But I think she had. I used to love Sundays. There was a rhythm to them, like a hymn hummed beneath breath. Church bells in the distance, the scent of rosemary chicken warming slowly in the oven, and the sunlight falling just right across my kitchen floor. I didn't need an audience to feel joy. I only needed the chance to give. Food was my language. The clink of dishes, the soft thud of napkins being folded, the kettle hissing like a whisper. All of it stitched the day together. Back then, Sunday meant something. It meant presence. Even when my daughter moved away and stopped coming home regularly, I still cooked. I'd sit at the table with 2 place settings out of habit just in case. You don't stop preparing love simply because no one shows up to receive it. So when the girl moved in, I thought maybe I could bring the old Sundays back. For a while, she humored me. Sat at the table, poked at her food, complimented my mashed potatoes with a distracted smile. She scrolled through her phone between bites, but I told myself it was fine. She was young. That's just how they are now. I let her wear her headphones in the kitchen while I carved the roast. I let her play her music over mine. I convinced myself it was enough just to have another heartbeat in the house. But then she started skipping them. At first she'd text from upstairs, "Hey, not feeling great. Gonna lie down or meeting a friend for brunch. Next time." And each time my hands would pause over the stove, the wooden spoon hovering in midair, and I'd feel something slide loose inside me. I stopped setting out 2 plates. Then I stopped lighting the candles. I ate at the counter in silence, staring at the empty seat that was supposed to mean connection. She began treating Sundays like any other day, laundry sprawled across the furniture, music blasting, greasy takeout containers appearing in the trash with no explanation. She'd walk past me, earbuds and nod once, and vanish into the spare room with her laughter echoing down the hall like wind through a broken window. One Sunday, I made her favorite macaroni and cheese the way she liked it, extra creamy paprika on top. I even wrote her name on a little sticky note and stuck it to the dish like it was a gift. I waited all afternoon. She didn't touch it. By evening, I found it cold and congealed in the fridge untouched. The note had fallen off. I threw it away without a word. I asked her once, careful and kind, if we could make Sunday dinners a tradition. "I just think it's nice," I said, "to mark the week's end with something warm." She shrugged and said, "You can still cook, Mama. Just don't expect me to always be part of it." As if what I needed was permission. As if kindness were something I had to ask for. After that, she started mocking the meals, not outright, but in sly little comments. "Oh, this again," or Do you ever try like other spices? She once brought home some boxed tofu bowl from a trendy health place and told me I should get with the times. I smiled. I always smiled. But something in my chest tightened every time she lifted a fork and looked at my food like it was a relic. One day she invited her friends over. 3 of them. Loud, perfume-thick, wearing sunglasses indoors. They brought their own drinks, their own food, and didn't say a word to me. They laughed from the living room as I sat quietly in the kitchen, my roast untouched, the music from her speaker, pulsing through the floor like a heartbeat that didn't belong to me. I caught a glimpse of myself in the hallway mirror. I was standing there with a dish towel in my hands, wringing it like a nervous bride. My reflection looked older than I remembered. Eyes dimmer, shoulders curved inward. I was the ghost of my own Sunday. Later that night, I found a slice of pie I had made, the one thing I thought she still liked, half eaten on the counter. Fork marks, jagged whipped cream, melting into a puddle. Beside it, a single napkin crumpled and tossed like a used tissue. I picked it up, stared at the crust smeared across porcelain, and felt something in me still, and then break. It wasn't about the food. It was about how easily someone could step into your life, be handed warmth, and then spit on it without a second thought. I used to believe that if you offered your heart on a plate, someone would treat it gently. But I was learning painfully that some people only see plates, not the hands that serve them. It began as little sighs, small fluttery things. I'd be mid-sentence telling a story from years ago, something soft and silly, something that once brought laughter to my kitchen, and she'd sigh. Not loudly, not rudely, just dismissively, a breath of disinterest that said, "Here she goes again." I remember sitting across from her at breakfast talking about my first date with my husband, how he'd shown up with 2 left shoes because he was so nervous. I laughed at the memory like I always did, but she didn't. She didn't even look up. She just stirred her coffee slowly, watching the cream swirl like a storm cloud. And when I asked, "Isn't that funny?" she said, with a tight, polite smile, the kind people give to strangers they don't want to talk to. I told myself she was tired. Maybe she didn't sleep well. But the next time it happened, it was different. I was showing her an old photo, me in the garden, sun hat, 2 big arms covered in dirt and pride, and she looked at it and said, "Wow, you've always dressed like that, huh?" Then laughed like it was a joke. It wasn't. I don't think she realized how sacred those stories were to me. Or maybe she did, and that made the mockery sweeter to her. Memory is all I have now. These tales, these fragments, they're how I stitch myself together each morning. When the knees ache, when the mirror becomes unkind, memory is what reminds me that I was someone once, that I still am. But to her they were clutter, rambling, background noise. One afternoon I was telling her about my daughter's first recital, how she wore blue velvet and froze up on stage until I whispered, "I'm here," and she found her voice. The girl looked at me and said, "Is this going somewhere?" Not harshly, casually, like she was skimming the surface of a boring article. And that was the first time I didn't finish my story. I just nodded and looked down at my hands. She started saying things like, "You've told me that already," or "That was 100 years ago," and I'd laugh along pretending I wasn't bleeding inside, because what else could I do, call her cruel? Tell her that every rolled eye carved a little deeper into me. She stopped asking questions too. In the early days, she'd ask about my recipes, my old friends, how I met my husband. Now if I started talking, she'd check her phone, scroll, smile at something else. I became background chatter the TV left on in an empty room. Once I overheard her on the phone saying it's like living with a walking scrapbook. Then she laughed, a real laugh, the kind I hadn't heard in weeks, and it wasn't for me. I stood just outside the door holding a folded blanket, and I felt my ears burn. I felt my breath stick in my throat. I used to believe that age brought reverence, that people would lean in closer when you spoke not further away. But she made me feel like an old coat left on a chair, something you tolerate until you can finally toss it aside. She even started correcting me. "No, Mama. That's not how phones work now," or "That's not what people say anymore." When I mispronounced a singer's name, she laughed so hard she had to call someone to share it. "You won't believe what she just said," she told them. And then, bless her heart though, that was the final twist. That syrupy phrase meant to cover cruelty in sugar. But the worst part wasn't the laughter. It was the loneliness that followed. The way I'd sit in my chair surrounded by the artifacts of a life well-lived, books, photos, heirlooms, and feel like none of it mattered, because in her eyes it didn't. I was a relic, a thing to be pitied, tolerated, never truly seen. I started talking to myself more, quietly under my breath, repeating the stories she wouldn't listen to, like prayers, like if I said them enough they wouldn't vanish. Because that's what it felt like vanishing. Every sigh, every eye roll, every half smile that said "you don't matter," they all chipped away at the girl I used to be. And yet I kept hoping that maybe one day she'd ask about the way I made jam from scratch, or want to know what my wedding smelled like, or ask why I keep that chipped teacup on the shelf even though it leaks. But she never did. She only saw the cracks, not the stories they held. It happened slowly, like the waterline rising in a sinking ship. You only realize you're drowning once your feet lose the floor. At first it was little things. My grocery list would go missing. I'd find oat milk instead of whole avocados instead of apples, protein bars instead of the rye bread I loved to toast each morning with plum jam. When I asked her, she waved her hand. "This stuff's better for you, Mama. Less sugar, less salt. Trust me." She said it like she was doing me a favor, like I didn't know my own body after 76 years of living in it. The pantry changed next. She reorganized it while I was napping, proudly declaring that she'd streamlined everything. The labels I'd written in cursive taped carefully to jars over the years were gone, replaced with generic stickers and containers she said were aesthetic. I opened the door and didn't recognize it. My own kitchen foreign to me, like someone had taken my memories and repackaged them in plastic. She took over the fridge shelf by shelf, her plant-based yogurts, meal kits, probiotic drinks that fizzed like soda. Soon the eggs were pushed to the back, and my old butter dish was nowhere to be found. I asked her if she'd seen it. She smiled like I was adorable and said, "Oh, that chipped thing, I threw it out. It didn't go with anything." Didn't go with anything. I stood there for a moment, holding the fridge door open, letting the cold air hit my legs while something much colder settled in my chest. That dish had belonged to my mother. She'd brought it over from Ireland, tucked in a blanket, survived wars and moves, and children banging it around at breakfast. But it didn't match the aesthetic, so it was gone. I wanted to scream. I wanted to cry. But instead, I said, "Okay, just that." Because when someone has already decided what matters, your pain becomes background noise. She started doing the shopping. At first I was relieved. My joints had been aching, and the walk to the store was getting harder. But then I realized she never asked me what I needed. She just bought what she liked. Almond flour, chia seeds, vegan cheese that tasted like wet cardboard. If I added something to the list, she'd conveniently forget it. I went to the store myself one morning after she left early. I walked the aisles, slowly relishing the sound of my shoes on linoleum, the clink of glass jars in my basket. I bought my rye bread, my butter, my jam. When she saw it later, she rolled her eyes. You know that stuff's basically poison, right? I smiled. Then I suppose I've made peace with dying happy. She didn't laugh. Then there was the stove. Mine was old white enamel, with the knobs worn smooth from years of love. It hummed a little when you turned it on, like it recognized you. One afternoon, I came home from a walk to find her and a man in the kitchen, her friend, I guess, installing a countertop hot plate. The oven's too clunky, she explained. This is faster, more modern. You'll love it. But I didn't. I hated it. I burned 3 pots trying to use that thing. No knobs, just touch buttons that beeped at me when I pressed too long. She mocked me gently. You're just not used to it yet. She said it like I was a toddler learning how to walk, as if my confusion was charming, as if my struggle was entertainment. Eventually, I stopped using the kitchen altogether. I let her cook, or more often order food in. The smells changed. Gone was the scent of roasting garlic, simmering broth, cinnamon rolls baking on Saturday mornings. Now it was takeout curry-boxed sushi spiced tofu that stained the air but never felt like home. One morning I walked into the kitchen and reached for my teacup. It was gone. The one with the faded roses on the rim, the tiny crack near the handle that I always turned away from my mouth. I'd used it every morning for decades. I asked her if she'd seen it. Oh, that old thing, I think I tossed it. It was pretty gross. My breath caught. I looked at her, really looked. She was scrolling through her phone chewing gum, not even glancing up. I realized in that moment I was no longer someone she saw, but something she managed. An old habit, a burden she dressed up in pet names and thin smiles. I stopped sitting at the kitchen table after that, ate my toast in my room, made my tea in the laundry sink with a travel kettle I dug out of a box. I began to avoid the space that had once been the heart of my home. Because when someone turns your sanctuary into their playground, and they do it with a smile, you start to believe maybe you were just borrowing it all along. And that's the cruelest theft of all, not what they take, but what they make you doubt you ever had. The first time her friends visited, I was excited. I thought maybe this would be a chance to bridge the gap between my world and hers. I baked scones the way my mother taught me, butter folded into flour with my bare hands. The kitchen smelled like warmth, an invitation. I even brought out the lemon curd I'd been saving, the kind that melts on your tongue like sunlight. I remember hearing their laughter before they even reached the porch, sharp, rapid, like high heels clicking across concrete. 3 of them. All smooth skin, high ponytails, oversized sunglasses, voices like champagne fizz. They swept in without knocking, without pausing, like they owned the very air. One of them looked me up and down and said, "Ah, you're her landlady. That's so cute." I wasn't sure how to respond to that, so I just smiled and offered the plate. "Would you girls like a scone?" I asked, lifting the tray with both hands. They blinked at it like I'd held up a dead animal. Gluten One asked, grimacing. Sugar said another, pulling a protein bar from her designer bag. My girl laughed and waved me off. "It's okay, Mama. We'll just order something later." She said it like I was a sweet old lady handing out rocks, like the offering of my heart, my history. My hands meant nothing more than inconvenience. I went back to my room and shut the door quietly behind me. Not slammed, not dramatic, just closed it like I was folding myself inward. From there I could hear everything. Music loud enough to rattle the cabinets, jokes and gossip voices rising and falling like waves. I heard my name more than once, muffled in laughter. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew the tone, that performative amusement, the kind that makes you want to disappear into the wallpaper. They stayed late, past midnight, long after I'd turned out the lights and lay staring at the ceiling. I heard heels on hardwood doors slamming, someone spilling something and laughing. No one cleaned it up. No one apologized. The next morning, the living room looked like a storm had passed through. Empty wine bottles on the table. A lipstick-stained glass tipped sideways on my grandmother's embroidered doily. Crumbs ground into the carpet. One of them had left a purse behind draped over the back of my favorite chair, like a flag of conquest. I cleaned it all up in silence. I used to love morning's light creeping through the windows, birds in the garden. But that morning the light felt harsh, and the silence wasn't peaceful. It was the silence of being unseen. She came down around noon, still in her robe, phone in hand. "Thanks for picking up," she said absently, pouring herself oat milk from a carton. "You're a lifesaver." Then she giggled and added, "God, weren't they hilarious?" I wanted to ask her hilarious to who. Instead I asked, "Do they know I'm not your landlady?" She didn't even blink. "Does it matter?" Yes, I wanted to say. Yes, it matters, because this is my house, because I opened the door, because I made you tea when you were too broken to sleep, because I fed you before you had words, because I gave you space and you turned it into a stage where I play the fool. But I said nothing. She started having them over more often. Some stayed overnight. I'd find strangers in my kitchen the next morning wearing my old cardigans like they were thrifted accessories. One of them asked if I had any oat milk for their coffee and looked confused when I said I didn't know what that was. I stopped going into the kitchen when they were around. I stayed in my room, headphones on, pretending I didn't hear the door slam or the music thump or the sound of my own things being used like props in someone else's movie. She began locking the bathroom door for hours, turning it into her salon. When I asked if she could be quicker, my knees stiff, my bladder impatient, she said, "You should have planned ahead, Mama. I have guests." Guests. Like I was the one interrupting, like I was the stranger. One night I passed the living room on the way to the laundry and heard her say, "She's sweet, just clingy. Like I know she means well, but it's exhausting." They all murmured their agreement. One of them said, "You're doing her a favor. Honestly, you should be charging rent." And they laughed. I stood there in the hallway, gripping the edge of the laundry basket, heart thudding like a small, frightened thing. I wanted to shout, "You're the guest, not me." But instead I backed into the shadows. Let their laughter spill past me like a wave I wasn't meant to survive. Because when someone calls you clingy for trying to connect, when they redefine your kindness as a burden, when they reduce your home to a crash pad and your care to background noise, that's when you realize you're no longer part of the story. You're just the setting. It was a Thursday morning when I found it. I'd been tidying the kitchen, wiping down the counters the way I always did when the weight of being unseen felt too heavy. I was humming quietly an old lullaby my mother used to sing when the sky was gray and there, tucked beneath the ceramic fruit bowl, was a folded piece of paper. Not typed, not torn from a notebook, but thick, cream-colored stationery. Fancy. Too fancy for shopping lists or take-out receipts. I picked it up, curious. It wasn't sealed, no name on the front. Just my address scrawled in a handwriting that wasn't hers, messier, more angular. I unfolded it slowly, thinking it might be a misdelivered note from a neighbor or a thank you card she forgot to give me. But it wasn't for me. It was a letter. A love letter. It began with, "I still dream about the way your fingers brushed my back that morning," and every word after that crawled deeper into my chest like thorns. The handwriting belonged to a man. I could tell from the way he crossed his T's, from the shape of his emotions. It wasn't a casual note. It was intimate, aching, desperate, full of apology and longing and heat. It spoke of shared beds and whispered regrets and promises made in the dark. And then I saw his name. It was her ex. The one she swore she'd left behind. The one she claimed had broken her heart beyond repair. The one she never talked about except to say he was a mistake. I stood there holding that paper, hands trembling just enough to make the words blur. The end of the letter was the sharpest cut. I still think about that house, about your room, about how it smelled like lavender and old books. If I ever come back, will you let me in? Lavender and old books. That was my room. Not hers, not theirs. Mine. She hadn't just brought herself into my home. She'd brought his memory too, hidden like a splinter under skin. I felt it then, the full intrusion. She had taken not only space, not only air, not only silence, but now even the intimacy of my sanctuary. My walls, my sheets, my stories. I wanted to confront her. Storm into her room, hold up the letter, demand answers. But when I heard her laughter echo from down the hall, soft, flirtatious speaking into her phone, I stopped. She was already talking to him again. I knew it without needing to hear the words. I could feel it in her posture and the way her eyes drifted to the window when she thought no one was watching. She had begun waiting for him, preparing maybe, for his return, for his re-entry into this life she was slowly sculpting out of mine. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, the letter tucked beneath my pillow, the way children hide secrets from monsters, my ears strained for every sound, her voice, her footsteps, the click of her door closing. I wondered what else she had planned, if she was already imagining him on the porch, hand in hers, me out of sight. The next morning she was radiant, a fresh dress, lipstick on the kind of glow a woman wears when someone has called her beautiful. "You look lovely," I offered gently, fishing for confirmation. She smiled, soft and sly. "I have someone coming by, old friend." I nodded, but inside my stomach turned to stone. I cleaned the house that day with a fury I hadn't known in years. Scrubbed baseboards, polished doorknobs, fluffed the pillows she always tossed to the floor. It wasn't about tidiness. It was about reclaiming space. I wanted the walls to remember me, to remember who I was before. She stayed in her room most of the day, music playing, low voice hushed on her phone. I heard her giggle once, and something in me snapped like a bone. You forgot, was broken. When I passed by the bathroom, I saw her makeup spread across the counter like a battlefield blush, foundation perfume that lingered long after she'd left the room. I stared at it all the way you stare at the aftermath of a storm, knowing nothing will ever be where it was again. Later that evening, I slipped the letter back where I found it. Not to keep her trust intact, but to let her hang herself with the rope she didn't know I'd seen. 'Cause now I was watching. Not with anger, with clarity. And I realized something she never expected, that old women can read between the lines just fine. That we know when we've been edited out of our own story. But I wasn't going to shout. No, I was going to wait. Let her write the next act. And when the curtain fell, I'd be the one holding the key. It started like any other morning. The sun came in low and gold, warming the worn wood floors, casting familiar lines across the curtains. I had an appointment that day, a checkup at the clinic down the road. Nothing serious, just the kind of visit old bones make out of habit. She knew I was going. I'd mentioned it twice the night before, even left a note on the fridge out of courtesy. I stepped out around 9 a.m., soft cardigan wrapped tight, purse in hand, the click of my shoes on the pavement steady as breath. The air smelled of jasmine and quiet. I remember thinking I'd pick up some fresh rolls on the way back, maybe surprise her. I still believed in small gestures even after everything. The appointment ran a little long. The nurse was new and gentle, and we talked about our gardens or lack thereof. It was past noon when I returned a paper bag of pastries in one hand, keys ready in the other. I tried the front door. It didn't budge. I frowned, tried again, rattled the knob, pressed harder. Still nothing. I moved to the back entrance. Same thing. Locked. Not just locked, bolted. From the inside. I knocked, lightly at first, then louder. I called her name. No answer. I circled back to the front, knocked again, sharper this time, calling through the wood. "It's me. I'm home." Still silence. But from inside I could hear it. Her music. That thudding, pulsing beat she always played too loud. I heard laughter. Not hers, his. A man's voice. Low, familiar, sliding through the cracks in the window frame like smoke. I stepped back, looked up, and through the sheer curtain in the living room I saw them. Not clearly, just outlines. Her form curled into his hand resting on her knee, a bottle of something glinting between them. They were laughing. I stood there for a long time, pastries cooling in my hand, keys useless in my pocket, like a stranger, like someone who'd come to the wrong house. Eventually, I sat on the porch swing, the same swing my husband had built when we moved in. The wood creaked beneath me like it remembered better days. I watched as the neighborhood passed by mothers with strollers, old men walking dogs. No one knew that the woman sitting there had been locked out of her own life. I waited 2 hours. No one came to the door. Not once. By the time she opened it, the sky had begun to bruise. I heard the latch turn and watched as she stepped out, all confidence and gloss. Her dress too short for the breeze, her smile too bright for guilt. "Oh," she said, as if she'd just noticed me. "I didn't know you'd be back so soon." I didn't answer. She looked down at the bag in my hand. "What's that?" "Bread," I said. My voice felt foreign, too small for my own throat. She took the bag, peeked inside, and said, "Oh, I don't really eat these." Then she left the bag on the porch rail and walked back inside. Didn't say sorry. Didn't say welcome home. Just disappeared. I stepped inside finally, and the house smelled different, like cologne and clove cigarettes, like someone else's evening. He wasn't there anymore, but his shadow lingered, a glass on the table, a jacket over my chair. She didn't mention locking me out, not once. Like it hadn't happened, like I'd imagined the whole thing. But I hadn't, and I wouldn't forget it. I lay awake that night with the door closed and the windows open, letting the air carry out whatever had been left behind. I stared at the ceiling and felt something in me stiffen, not with anger, not yet, but with decision. A soft, firm line drawn in a room no one else could see. Because when a woman has lived her whole life opening doors for others, feeding them, housing them, loving them without condition, being locked out becomes more than inconvenience. It becomes revelation. And in that silence on that porch, I'd heard the truth. I wasn't welcome. Not anymore. And if I wasn't welcome, then she wasn't family. She was just a guest. It was a week later when he returned, not in a storm, not with drama, but like someone who belonged, as if he'd never truly left. I was trimming dead leaves from my potted basil when I heard his voice, low and polite, drifting in through the screen door. "Hey, she said I left my toolbox here. Figured I'd swing by and grab it." I didn't answer right away. My hands froze in the soil, fingers buried up to the knuckles. For a moment I stayed still, listening to the breeze, to the rustle of her feet upstairs, to the way his tone didn't carry the nervousness of a visitor, but the familiarity of someone reclaiming space. I wiped my hands on a kitchen towel and stepped into the hallway. He was standing there, broad-shouldered, stubble along his jaw, a sun-faded cap in his hand. He looked up at me and smiled the way a man does when he's not sure if he's welcome, but has decided to pretend he is anyway. "You must be her mom," he said. I didn't correct him. Not then. "She said I left it in the closet," he added, gesturing vaguely toward the back of the house. "Mind if I stepped aside, not out of kindness, not out of fear, out of curiosity. I wanted to see how he moved through my house, whether he hesitated, whether he looked around with the awe of a guest or the entitlement of someone who had once made himself at home. He walked slowly, respectfully, but with ease, like someone revisiting a memory, and I followed quietly, my eyes watching him, more than my feet watched the floor. The closet creaked open, and there it was, a battered red box with chipped paint and stickers from another life. He knelt and picked it up, like it was a long-lost pet, brushing the dust off the handle. "I told her I'd get it weeks ago," he said, glancing back at me. "Never got around to it." That was all I offered. He stood taller than I remembered from that glimpse through the curtain. He looked around the room, my sewing room once now cluttered with her tote bags and trendy decor things that didn't breathe the same air as the rest of the house. He didn't comment on the changes, but his eyes paused on the walls, on the old clock still ticking steadily above the doorway. He smiled just faintly. "I used to sit in here sometimes," he said. "She didn't like it, but it was the quietest room." I raised an eyebrow. Didn't like quiet. He chuckled. Not her style. He was right. She descended the stairs minutes later, barefoot, face painted with surprise that barely masked annoyance. "Oh, you're here," she said. "I told you I'd let you know when it was a good time." He tapped the box. Didn't think I needed permission. They stood facing each other in a moment I wasn't meant to witness. A look passed between them. Not love, not longing. Something older, worn out anger, familiar resignation. The way people stare when the fire's gone out, but the smoke still lingers. She turned to me and something in her eyes flared. "Hope he didn't bother you." I met her gaze, calm and clear. Not at all. He was polite. He smiled at that, just a twitch at the corners. Then he said something that stopped time. "She's good company, more than I remember." My girl blinked. "You always were good at playing nice." He shrugged, nonchalant. "Maybe I just got tired of pretending some people matter more than they do." She scoffed and turned away, brushing past us toward the kitchen, her footsteps sharp. He looked at me. Then really looked, not with pity, not with amusement, with respect, like he saw someone standing there. Not just a fixture, not just the wallpaper. "You've kept this place together," he said, "even with the storm inside." And it hit me that he knew. Not everything, not the details, but enough. We stood in silence for a few moments, the kind that isn't awkward, but sacred. Then he lifted the toolbox and said, "I'll get out of your hair." "You don't have to rush," I replied without thinking. He paused. His eyes softened. "Some things you don't rush, I guess." At the door he hesitated. "I don't know what she told you about me, but whatever it wasn't the full truth." I nodded. "It never is." He smiled then, a real one this time. Not charming, not rehearsed. Grateful. Then he stepped out, boots thudding against the porch planks like punctuation at the end of a forgotten sentence. I watched him walk down the drive, the sun casting a long shadow beside him, the red box swinging gently like an anchor. And I thought to myself, not for the first time, that sometimes the people who return aren't intrusions. They're reminders of who we used to be before we started handing our power away in pieces. He came back a few days later. This time there was no excuse, no toolbox to collect, no forgotten item to claim, just a knock at the door in the early afternoon sun, steady and polite, the kind of knock that waits, not demands. I opened it, expecting someone else, maybe the postman or one of her never-ending stream of guests, But there he stood, same sun-faded cap, same quiet eyes. "Didn't mean to intrude," he said. "Just had a little time." I didn't answer right away. I stepped aside like I always do. But this time something in the motion was different. Not habit, not obligation, invitation. He followed me through the house without comment, eyes catching the same changes mine had. The curtain rods replaced with modern bars, the hallway mirror, my favorite one, with the carved wooden frame now tucked away behind a coat rack that didn't belong to me. I saw him notice it, saw the way he quietly grieved alongside me without saying a word. We settled into the back sunroom, the one that hadn't been touched yet. My chair, his borrowed one, and a table between us that still bore the scratches of a puzzle I'd once worked on every afternoon. I poured tea out of instinct, not performance, and he took it with both hands as if it were something sacred. The silence between us wasn't awkward. It was gentle, familiar, the kind of silence that wraps around two people like an old blanket. "I used to hate the quiet," he said eventually. "But now I kind of crave it." I smiled. "The noise fades differently when you've had your fill of it." He nodded. She always needed more of it, more sound, more people, more eyes on her. I didn't say her name, neither did he, but we both felt her in the air like a scent that never quite leaves a room. He asked me about the house, how long I'd lived here, whether I'd planted those rose bushes out front. I told him about my husband's hands, how he'd built the deck board by board, how we used to dance on it in the rain when the world got too loud. He listened the way I remembered men used to listen back when the art of conversation hadn't died behind glowing screens. His eyes didn't drift. He didn't interrupt. He just stayed present. I told him stories. Not because I needed to be heard, but because he made space for them. He laughed when I laughed, fell quiet when the memories turned blue. He didn't offer advice, didn't suggest how I might adapt to the modern way. He just let me be whole. It had been a long time since anyone did that. He told me things, too little things, that he worked odd jobs now, that he missed fishing but didn't miss waking up at 5 a.m., that he'd never really stopped caring, just stopped knowing how to show it. "I didn't leave the way I wanted to," he said. "I was shut out before I knew the door was even closing." I looked at him for a long moment and said, "Funny how familiar that sounds." He nodded and we sipped our tea. The sun shifted as the hours passed. The room turned golden, the kind of gold that makes your bones ache in a good way. I could have told him everything. Then the locks, the silences, the way she'd erased my name from things I once called mine. But I didn't. He already knew enough to see that the woman across from him wasn't helpless, just tired of being unheard. He asked me if I still baked. I told him no, not for a while. "Why not?" he asked. I hesitated. It's hard to cook for someone who thinks love comes in delivery bags. He didn't laugh. He just looked at me with the kind of sorrow that's laced with respect. "I'd eat your baking," he said, "just so you know." And I believed him. When he finally stood to leave, the room felt quieter, not emptier, just still, like something had shifted into place. "Thanks for the tea," he said, "and the company." "You're welcome," I replied, and I meant it. At the door, he paused. "You ever think about what you'd do if it were just you? If you had the house to yourself again?" I looked at the staircase, at the hallway beyond it, at the shadows she cast without even trying. "All the time," I said. He nodded slowly, then without pushing, he added, "Well, you don't need a reason to take your space back." I watched him walk away, each step quieter than the last, and when the door closed behind him, I leaned against it, tea still warm in my palm, heart even warmer. Because I realized something. I wasn't alone. I wasn't crazy. and I wasn't done. He came back once more just before dusk. No knock this time, just a gentle tap, the kind that says, "I'm not here to take just to see if you're okay." I opened the door and found him there holding a small brown bag and a tin thermos, like he'd stopped by a corner deli and remembered someone used to matter. "Thought you might like soup," he said. He didn't bring it inside right away. We stood on the porch for a minute listening to the cicadas buzz and the wind move through the lilac hedge. There was something unspoken in the air between us, not romance, not nostalgia, but dignity, a kind of quiet understanding that doesn't come often in life, especially not at our age. "I won't stay long," he added. "Just figured, maybe you could use a warm meal that tastes like someone still gives a damn." I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. "Come in?" We sat at the kitchen table, my table. He poured the soup into 2 chipped bowls, mine old and familiar. Not the new ceramic one she'd bought that I never touched. It smelled of tomato and basil, rich and real. I dipped my spoon in slowly and tasted it. It was nothing fancy, but it was made with care. She wasn't home that evening. Out with friends, I assumed. Or maybe him again, though it didn't feel like that mattered anymore. Her absence was a gift I hadn't asked for, but one I cherished. He looked around and said, "I can still tell what parts are yours." I nodded. "They're fading." "They don't have to." That sentence sat with me. I looked down at my hands, wrinkled, veined, but still capable, still strong. They'd held children-built gardens, cradled the sick and dying, folded hundreds of Sunday napkins. And yet lately, they'd only folded in on themselves, into silence. "She talks down to you," he said plainly. "I heard it. Back then. I see it now." I shrugged. "She says I take things too personally." "You're a person," he said. "You're supposed to take things personally. That's what makes you alive." There was no poetry in his voice, no performance, just truth. "She used to be different," I whispered. "No," he replied gently. "She used to pretend to be different." We didn't speak for a while after that. The kind of silence that heals instead of harms, the kind of stillness that doesn't rush in to be filled. I looked out the window and watched the trees sway soft and slow. "She doesn't respect you," he added after a while, "but that doesn't mean you've lost your worth." I swallowed and the soup suddenly felt thicker in my throat. "She tells me I overreact, that I forget things, that I make stuff up." He leaned forward, elbows on the table, eyes steady on mine. "You don't. You see clearly. That scares her. You remember who she used to be, and she doesn't like being reminded." I blinked. My throat tightened. He continued, softer now. "You still deserve respect. You still deserve peace. And if she can't give you either, then maybe she doesn't deserve your roof, your food, your name." His words didn't hit like an explosion. They settled like dust, gently coating everything I hadn't been willing to name. I looked around the kitchen, the one that no longer felt like mine, and saw it differently. The space she'd overtaken. The plates she'd pushed to the back. The silence I'd let bloom because I was too tired to argue. I thought about the way she mocked my stories, the way she flinched when I spoke too long, the way she'd lock me out without blinking, and then act like I had been the problem all along. I thought about my home, the one I'd scrubbed and painted and filled with soft things and laughter, and how it had become a stage for someone else's play, someone who had mistaken generosity for weakness. He stood after we'd finished, washed the bowls without being asked, dried them with the towel I always kept folded under the sink. He moved around the kitchen with respect, like every item had meaning, like every inch had a memory worth protecting. At the door, he turned to me. "Whatever you decide, just make sure you're not giving away your kindness to someone who thinks it's free." I nodded. He started to leave but paused. You still deserve a house that speaks your name, he said. And then he was gone. I closed the door behind him and leaned against it the same way I had the day she locked me out. Only this time, I wasn't the one shut outside. This time, I was inside, fully, deeply, rightfully inside. And for the first time in a long time, I felt the walls remember me. Not as an old woman, not as a nuisance, but as the soul of this place. And suddenly I knew. The silence she feared. It was mine to give. It was a quiet morning, overcast, and still the kind of morning that whispers to you in soft tones, nudging you toward clarity. I woke before dawn, not from pain or noise, but from that strange kind of knowing that settles into your bones with age, a kind of truth that doesn't knock, doesn't ask, it simply arrives. I rose slowly, wrapped in my cardigan, and brewed my tea in silence. No clanging dishes, no footsteps overhead, no music thudding through walls. She had stayed out all night again. I could always tell by the way the front door sat slightly ajar, like it, too, had grown tired of being closed behind her. As I sat at the kitchen table sipping Earl Grey from the chipped cup she hadn't yet thrown away, I stared at the bookshelf across the room. Not the one in the living room, the one in the hall by the coat closet, where the real things lived. The file box was still there, the old navy blue one with the clasp that barely held shut anymore. It smelled of paper and dust and history. I pulled it out gently and carried it to the table like an offering. Inside were the documents that built this life. Deeds, marriage certificates, birth records, letters from lawyers now long dead. And beneath them, where I had tucked them, years ago, in case I ever forgot who I was, sat 2 folded papers, the lease and the will. The lease wasn't new. It was the original one my husband and I had signed when we purchased the house outright, after years of scrimping and sacrifice. I ran my fingers over the date 1978. The ink had faded in places, but our names were still there, bold and certain, etched, in a time when permanence still meant something. And then the will, the most recent version I had drawn up after he passed, after the children scattered like dandelion seeds on the wind. I unfolded it slowly, read every line, even though I knew them by heart. The house, the savings, the tiny plot of land behind the shed where I once dreamed of building a greenhouse, all of it still in my name, still under my care, still mine. She had never asked, not once. She had assumed, and I had let her. That was the real ache, not what she took, but what I'd surrendered. My boundaries, my voice, my sense of rightful ownership over the things I'd poured my soul into for decades. She moved through my life like it was a gift shop, taking what she wanted, rearranging the shelves, and leaving me to clean up the wreckage. But now I held the proof in my hands, legal, binding, unmistakable. Her name wasn't written anywhere. Not on the lease, not on the deed, not in the will. And that changed everything. I sat there for what felt like hours, the tea long gone cold beside me, staring at the papers that grounded me, the ones that reminded me I was not a guest in my own home. I was the architect of it, the memory keeper, the foundation. She had called me senile once, in a fight dismissed my words like they were fog. You forget things she'd said. You're lucky I'm here. But the truth was she'd forgotten who I am, or maybe she never really cared to know. I gathered the documents carefully, placing them back into the folder, but I left them at the front of the file this time. I wouldn't hide them again. I wanted them near. I wanted her to feel them like iron in the walls, like roots under the floor. Later that afternoon, she waltzed in perfume trailing behind her voice, bright with stories about some gallery opening she'd attended. She didn't notice the file box on the table right away. But when she did, she paused. "What's all this?" she asked, poking at the edges like it might bite. Just organizing, I replied softly, folding one paper back into its envelope. She reached for the will. I covered it with my hand. She blinked. I didn't think I needed to be in it, she said. Eyes narrowed slightly. You know, I've been here for you. I've helped. I looked up at her, really looked. Her youth, her charm, the carefully curated chaos she carried like perfume. And I saw it clearly for the first time, the entitlement. The story she'd been writing one, in which I was the minor character in her narrative. You helped yourself, I said. Calm, firm. You were a guest. I made you feel at home. But don't confuse kindness with ownership. She laughed. Are you serious? I am, I said, voice steady. I always have been. She scoffed, muttered something under her breath, and walked out of the room, her footsteps louder than they needed to be. But I didn't flinch. I stayed seated, hands resting on the folder, like a priestess at her altar. Because now I knew. I wasn't confused. I wasn't crazy. And I wasn't powerless. Not anymore. The sun was just beginning to cast pale fingers through the curtains when I made my decision. The house was quiet, too quiet, and for the first time in months, the silence felt like a balm instead of a wound. I packed a small bag with things I couldn't bear to leave behind: my favorite shawl, a journal filled with memories, a faded photograph of my husband smiling beside the lilac bushes. The rest I left behind. The clutter she'd made of my life, the cold spaces she'd claimed as hers, the empty chair at the dinner table, the locked doors, the heavy air. I walked slowly through the rooms, touching surfaces, as if saying goodbye to old friends. The kitchen counters, once vibrant with the scent of roasting garlic, now smelled faintly of perfume and regret. The spare room, once my sanctuary, held traces of her presence, like shadows that refused to fade. At the front door I found him waiting, the man who had returned quietly, who had seen me without judgment, who had offered kindness when it was scarce. His eyes softened when he saw me. I'm ready, I said. He nodded and reached into his pocket, pulling out a set of keys. She said you'd give them to me when the time came. I handed them over without hesitation. The metal felt cold and heavy in my palm, but it was a weight I was glad to bear. This house belongs to someone who knows its stories, I said quietly. Someone who deserves to feel safe here. He smiled, understanding the meaning behind my words. I'll take good care of it. As he slid the keys into his pocket, I felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness. I wasn't handing over just a set of locks and doors. I was passing on a chapter, a legacy, a part of myself. But I knew it was time. I watched as he stepped inside his presence, steady and sure. The house seemed to breathe again, as if waking from a long sleep. She appeared moments later, face flushed with anger, voice raised in accusations and disbelief. I listened from the porch, the cool morning air filling my lungs as I sipped the last of my tea. She screamed his name, demanded answers, but I stayed silent. Because this was no longer my battle. I had given her a choice, and she had chosen to fight the wrong war. As I turned away, the house behind me felt lighter, like the weight of years had finally lifted. I had reclaimed my peace. And in that quiet victory, I found my freedom. I found myself seated at a small table by the window of a quiet cafe down the street, the kind with chipped paint on the door, and a bell that jingled softly every time it opened. The sky was heavy with gray clouds, and the air smelled faintly of rain and fresh bread. My hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea, the steam curling upward like whispered prayers. From this little sanctuary, I watched my house across the street, my home, the place that held a lifetime of memories, now a stage for a drama I no longer wished to partake in. Through the rain-speckled glass, I saw her, My girl pacing back and forth, her face-flushed hands thrown up in frustration. She screamed his name, a voice carrying the weight of anger and disbelief. The ex, calm and collected, stood on the porch, keys in hand, eyes steady and unyielding. I sipped my tea slowly, letting the warmth seep into my bones. I wasn't surprised by the scene. I'd lived through the silence, the slights, the slow erasure of myself, but I had stepped away now. I was watching from a distance, a witness, not a participant, the pain no longer mine to carry. I thought about the years I'd spent opening doors, literal and figurative, welcoming strangers, holding space, bending until I nearly broke. I remembered the dinners cooked with love, the stories told in the quiet evenings, the gentle hopes that kindness would be returned. But kindness isn't always returned. Sometimes it's taken for granted. Sometimes it's met with cold. And sometimes it's enough to walk away. I felt the rain start soft at first, then steady. It washed the streets, blurred the edges of the world. I closed my eyes and breathed it in, the fresh scent of cleansing, of new beginnings. In that moment, I understood something profound. I didn't need to raise my voice. I just needed to remember my worth. Some endings are just beginnings with the noise turned off. I gave them silence, and in it I found peace. The rain tapped gently against the window pane as I sat back, the tea growing cold in my hands, but my heart growing lighter with every passing breath. For the first time in a long time, I felt free. The world outside softened, muffled by the rain, and so did the ache inside me. Time stretched slow and gentle, carrying away the sharp edges of betrayal and pain. I let myself sink into the quiet, letting the stillness wrap around me like a warm shawl against the chill. The house, the memories, the people, they were all part of a story that wasn't mine to tell anymore. I had done what I could. I had loved, lost, and learned. Now all that remained was dignity, the kind that doesn't shout or demand, but stands steady and sure. Freedom was not loud. It was a whisper, a slow, steady heartbeat beneath the noise. And in that whisper I found myself again.